In her book, Biased, psychology professor Jennifer Eberhardt shares a story of a small crime spree in Oakland, California. Specifically, middle-aged Asian women were getting their purses snatched while they were shopping in Chinatown, and the snatchers tended to be young, teenage black boys. And when police would go after these cases, they would tend to fall apart because these Asian women couldn't often pick the culprit out of a police lineup. Years later, when they were able to catch at least a couple of these purse snatchers, they asked them, "Why target these women in particular?" And they replied, "Well, we know that Asian women can't tell one black face from another. We know we can get away with it because we'll never be identified." In her book, Eberhardt writes that these teenage boys didn't need a mask to pull off their crime. Their face was their mask. In this video, we'll see how this is one example of a common psychological bias, which is that we're just not that great at distinguishing people who are different from us. In psychology, we often refer to ingroups versus outgroups. Ingroups are any group with which you yourself identify, whereas your outgroups are groups that you don't identify with. So for me, for example, I'm from Chicago, so Chicagoans would be my in-group, and other cities would be my out-group. I'm a professor, so other professors would be in my in-group, whereas students might be my out-group. I'm white, so other white people would be in my in-group, whereas other racial groups would be my out-groups. And when it comes to in-groups and out-groups, there's a sneaky psychological bias that tends to crop up. It's called the Outgroup Homogeneity effect. Yeah, it's a mouthful, but the idea is pretty simple. It's just that we have this tendency to appreciate the uniqueness and variability within our own groups, but then we assume more uniformity among people in our outgroups. Let's look at one study that tested this bias. A group of researchers at Yale surveyed a bunch of young college students and also a bunch of elderly folks living in a Florida retirement home. And sometimes the survey asked them to rate their own age group, but other times it asked them to rate the other age group. Specifically, they were given a bunch of traits: irritability, mood, friendliness. And these traits were broken into levels. Very unfriendly, somewhat friendly, very friendly. They were asked to imagine 100 young people or 100 elderly people and estimate the percentage of them who would be at each level of each trait. The point of this was to see whether people lump everyone in a group into one level of the trait, they're all the same, or whether they acknowledge that people in that group are all over the place. A bunch of friendly people, a bunch of unfriendly people, a bunch somewhere in the middle. And what they found was that college students tended to think young people were all over the map in terms of these traits, but that elderly people were all really lumped together. They're all the same. But when elderly people take the survey, they see elderly people as all over the place on these traits, and they lump young people all together. They're all the same. As another example of this, a different group of researchers gave surveys to 3 different sororities at the University of Oregon. And in these surveys, everybody rated their own sorority and each of the other 2. And the surveys were things like, how much are the people in this sorority partying? How studious are the people in this sorority? How good looking are the people in this sorority, etc. But more to our point, they also asked everyone, how similar to each other are the members of this sorority? What they found was that when people were rating their own sororities, they appreciated the differences between its members. But when it came to the other sororities, they were like, yeah, they're all kind of the same, aren't they? That's the outgroup homogeneity effect. But this is just a few studies. So to zoom out and look at everything we know, some psychologists recently conducted a meta-analysis, which is a study of studies. Very trippy. They collected more than 170 tests of the outgroup homogeneity effect from more than 12,000 research participants over the years. And when you look across all of these studies, what they found was a definite tendency for people to see other groups as more homogeneous than their own. Now, that doesn't mean it's always this way. It does happen sometimes that we see our own groups as being more homogeneous than other groups. For example, this often happens when we have a strong need to feel like we belong in our group. When we have this need, we can sometimes see the members of our groups as more similar to each other and to ourselves than they really are. Nevertheless, the meta-analysis seems to conclude that perceiving other groups as more homogeneous is the norm. So this bias centers on our perceptions of what our own groups and other groups are like. What are their personalities? How do they behave? But that story from the beginning about those women in Chinatown who couldn't identify who took their purse, that was about what we see. Which brings us to a particular kind of outgroup homogeneity bias. It's called the CrossRace Effect. This is a bias in face recognition. Lots of research going back to the 60s has shown that people are better at recognizing faces from their own racial group than they are at recognizing faces from other racial groups. Here's how these studies work. Participants in a study see a whole bunch of faces, some black, some white, and then later on, they do a simple memory test. They see a face, and they just have to say whether they saw that face earlier in the study, or whether it's a new face. Saw it, or didn't see it. And what these studies tend to find are that white participants are pretty good at recognizing whether or not they saw a given white face. But they're not as good at recognizing whether they saw a given black face. For black participants, though, it's just the opposite. They're pretty good at recognizing whether or not they saw the black faces, but not so much for the white faces. Neuroscience studies even show that this bias occurs at the most basic level of processing faces in the brain. There's a particular part of the brain that specializes in face recognition, so much so that neuroscientists call that part of the brain the fusiform face area, or FFA. And there's one thing that's worth knowing about the brain, which is that it can be pretty lazy. When it encounters something new, it's firing on all cylinders, but once it sees the same thing over and over and over again, it stops working as hard. It's like, yeah, I already saw that thing. Wake me up when there's something new. And so researchers wanted to see what happens to the fusiform face area when white participants encounter two faces in a row. When they saw the same face twice in a row, the FFA predictably reacted less strongly the second time. This was true when it was two white faces in a row or two black faces in a row. Their brains recognized that they were seeing the same person twice, and so they didn't need to work as hard the second time. But when these participants would see one white face, followed up by a different white face, the FFA didn't fall asleep. It perked up for the second face. But what about what happens when a white participant sees one black face, followed by a different black face? Objectively, these are two different people, and yet their brains acted like they were seeing the same face twice. The FFA reacted less strongly to the second face. It was as though it was saying, oh yeah, him again. No need to go full power. Taken together, these studies highlight the outgroup homogeneity bias, or people's failure to appreciate how varied and distinct members of other groups actually are from each other. Psychologists who study eyewitness testimony are rightly concerned about this bias, but even at a more general level, this bias helps us understand a little bit about why people are so able to stereotype and generalize about entire groups of people, thinking they're all the same. For more social psychology, subscribe to this YouTube channel or check out my podcast at opinionsciencepodcast.com.